It was a chilly evening in New York, the kind where the city lights glow against the falling dusk and the air feels sharp enough to bite. I had just left work and stopped by the grocery store, not expecting anything unusual. As I walked toward the entrance, the crowd moved in its usual rush, all people in coats and scarves, clutching bags, hurrying home. And then, I noticed her. A little girl stood near the sliding doors, shivering in a thin hoodie. Her jeans were too big, her sneakers worn down to the soles, and her tangled hair framed a pale, tired face. Her small frame was almost hidden among the sea of strangers bustling past her, but her eyes caught mine. Wide, dark, and filled with a kind of hunger that went beyond food. They carried years of struggle in a child far too young to bear them. She pressed her hands against her stomach as she stared through the glass doors at the rows of food inside the store. Fresh bread, bright fruits, and warm cooked meals were within reach, yet impossibly far for someone like her. It was the kind of scene that makes your heart tighten, and for a second, I almost thought she was a ghost, too fragile, too out of place in the noisy city evening. No one else seemed to notice. Businessmen on phones, women carrying shopping bags, teenagers laughing as they walked past. Everyone's life moved forward as if she didn't exist. She didn't beg, didn't speak, didn't even move. Via just stood there with quiet desperation written all over her. I slowed down, torn between the instinct to mind my own business and the pull of compassion. In a city like New York, you see hardship every day, but something about here so young, so silent, it stopped me in my tracks. I couldn't just walk away, my conscience wouldn't allow it. I took a step closer and crouched slightly so I wouldn't tower over her. Her gaze shifted nervously to me, as though she expected to be chased off or scolded. Her lips parted but no words came. I softened my voice and asked, "Are you hungry?" She hesitated, looking down at the ground, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her oversized hoodie. Then, after a long pause, she gave the faintest nod, almost ashamed to admit it. That tiny gesture was enough. My chest ached as if someone had squeezed it tight. I knew in that moment that I couldn't leave without helping her. "Come on," I said gently, gesturing toward the entrance. She hesitated again, glancing around like a cornered animal, unsure if she could trust me. But finally, she followed, her small footsteps echoing softly on the pavement as we stepped inside. The warmth of the store hit us instantly, contrasting sharply with the cold air outside. Bright lights illuminated rows of fresh produce and warm pastries. She stared around, eyes wide, like she had stepped into a dream. People passed us, not giving her a second glance, but I noticed the way she kept her arms wrapped around herself, as though afraid someone would tell her she didn't belong. I grabbed a basket and walked toward the deli counter. "What would you like?" I asked her, but she stayed silent, eyes darting nervously from sandwiches to salads to fruit cups. I realized then she wasn't used to being given a choice, so I picked up a fresh turkey sandwich, an apple, and a small carton of milk. I added a banana for good measure. When I handed the food to her, she froze. For a second, she just stared at the sandwich, her eyes glistening, as if it were the most precious thing she had ever been offered. Slowly, with trembling hands, she accepted it. The first bite she took nearly broke me. She tried to eat slowly, as though savoring every chew, but hunger won out and she devoured the sandwich like she hadn't eaten in days. I didn't rush her. I just stood nearby, pretending to browse items so she could eat in peace. Every now and then, she glanced at me, her expression a mixture of caution and gratitude. When the sandwich was gone, she took a sip of the milk, then the fruit, finishing everything in silence. Finally, she whispered, "Thank you." A broken bar. The words were so soft I barely heard them, but they carried a weight that struck deeper than any loud declaration of gratitude ever could. I smiled gently and nodded, but inside, my heart was heavy. What kind of world leaves a child starving outside a grocery store? She was no different from the kids who run around playgrounds, laughing and carefree, yet here she was fighting to survive in silence. For a moment, I thought about asking her more questions, about her family, about where she lived, but the fear in her eyes told me not to push. She had walls built high, probably from years of disappointment and neglect. All I could do was offer her this small act of kindness and hope it gave her even a little relief. We walked outside together, and the cold hit us again. She pulled her hoodie tighter around her thin frame, the sleeves nearly swallowing her hands. She looked at me once more, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something else, but no words came. Instead, she gave a shy, almost invisible smiley, the kind you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. Then, before I could say anything, she turned and hurried off into the crowd, disappearing between the blur of people and lights. I stood there, holding my grocery bag, feeling strangely hollow. She had vanished as quickly as she appeared, leaving me wondering about her story. As I walked home that night, I couldn't shake her from my thoughts. The city buzzed around me, cars honking, people talking, music spilling from open bars, but all I could see was her frail figure standing outside that store. I kept asking myself where she had gone, whether she had a home, whether she was safe. I told myself I had done what I could, given her food, shown her kindness, but deep down, it didn't feel like enough. Something inside me whispered that this was not the end of our story, that fate had placed her in my path for a reason. When I reached my apartment, I unpacked my groceries in silence. The pasta and vegetables I had planned for dinner suddenly felt unimportant. I sat at the table, staring at my plate, but all I could think about was the little girl's whispered thank you, and how fragile it sounded. That night, as I lay in bed, the city lights flickering through my window, I promised myself that if I ever saw her again, I wouldn't just walk away. Because sometimes, the smallest act of kindness isn't small at all. It's the beginning of something much bigger, something neither you nor the other person could ever expect. And though I didn't know it yet, that single sandwich would change both our lives forever. 3 days passed since I had given that little girl food outside the grocery store, but I couldn't get her out of my mind. I wondered if she was okay, if she had managed to eat again, or if she was still out there wandering the streets, hungry and alone. It was strange how someone I had met only once could leave such an impression, but the memory of her thin frame and soft thank you had carved itself into my heart. That evening, as I sat at home in my small apartment, I heard a sudden knock at the door. At first, I thought it was a neighbor or maybe a delivery, but when I opened the door, my breath caught. Standing there was the same little girl. Her hair was still tangled, her clothes still loose, but this time she wasn't alone. Beside her stood a woman, clearly her mother, her face weary, her posture heavy with exhaustion. She clutched a small, worn-out bag, the kind that looked like it carried everything she owned. The little girl smiled shyly and pointed at me, her voice brighter than I remembered. "Mom, this is the person who gave me food." Her mother's eyes immediately welled with tears. She lowered her head as if ashamed, her voice breaking as she said, "Yeah, broken bar, I don't know where else to go." Her words hit me harder than I expected. This wasn't just about hunger, it was about survival, about a mother trying to protect her child while carrying her own weight of despair. I could see it in her tired eyes, in the way her shoulders slumped as though she had been carrying the world on her back for too long. It wasn't easy for her to stand there, asking for help from a stranger. For a moment, I was frozen, unsure of what to do. My apartment was small, just a single bedroom, a modest living room, and a kitchen barely big enough for one person. But as I looked at the little girl and then at her mother, I knew I couldn't turn them away. How could I? They had already been moving from place to place, living in shelters, never finding stability. The little girl had trusted me enough to bring her mother here, to my door, and I couldn't let that trust be broken. "Come in," I said quietly, stepping aside. They entered slowly, almost cautiously, as though afraid they would be a burden. My apartment wasn't much, but compared to the streets and shelters, it must have felt like a sanctuary. The little girl sat on the edge of the couch, her small hands folded neatly on her lap. Her mother stood for a moment before lowering herself into the armchair, her bag still clutched tightly as though she feared someone might take it away. The silence between us was heavy, filled with unspoken words and uncertainty about what came next. I walked into the kitchen and prepared some tea, trying to give them a moment to breathe. When I returned, I handed a cup to her mother. She accepted it with trembling hands and whispered, "Thank you." Her voice was soft, but the weight of her gratitude was unmistakable. She took a sip, and for the first time since she arrived, I saw a flicker of relief in her tired eyes. The little girl leaned against her, and I realized that this simple memento warm tea in a safe room was something they hadn't experienced in far too long. As the evening went on, her mother began to speak in fragments. She told me they had been staying in shelters for months, sometimes on friends' couches, sometimes even on park benches when there was nowhere else. Life had been hard since she lost her job, and with no family nearby to help, survival became their daily battle. Every word she spoke carried the heaviness of struggle, but also the quiet strength of someone who had done everything possible to protect her child. I listened carefully, not interrupting, because what she needed most was to be heard. When bedtime came, I set up a blanket and pillow on the couch for the little girl, and offered the bedroom to her mother. At first, she resisted, insisting she didn't want to impose, but I told her firmly, "You both need rest tonight, just rest." Finally, she agreed. I stayed on the couch that night, not sleeping much. Instead, I lay awake, thinking about how a small act of buying a sandwich had led to this moment. Life has a strange way of weaving stories together, and I couldn't shake the feeling that our paths were meant to cross. In the quiet of the night, I could hear the little girl's soft breathing as she slept. It was steady, peaceful, the kind of sleep a child deserves, though I suspected she hadn't known it in a long time. Her mother, too, finally let go of her exhaustion, resting in the safety of four walls that weren't temporary or crowded with strangers. Watching them find even this small comfort in my home stirred something deep within me. I realized kindness wasn't just about food or shelter, it was about restoring dignity, about reminding people they were not invisible. The next morning, the smell of coffee filled the kitchen as I made breakfast. Scrambled eggs, toast, and orange juice. It wasn't much, but when the little girl came in and saw the table set, her face lit up with joy that made the room brighter. Her mother followed, still looking tired, but her eyes softer than the night before. They ate quietly at first, as though unsure they were truly allowed to enjoy it, but slowly, the tension eased. The little girl giggled at the way the toast popped up from the toaster, and for the first time, I heard her laugh. That laugh was everything. It was proof that hope was still alive inside her, buried beneath hardship but not extinguished. And as I sat across from them, sipping my coffee, I realized something. This wasn't just about offering temporary shelter. This was about connection, about building trust, about showing them they weren't alone. What began with one meal outside a grocery store had grown into something far bigger. It was no longer just about feeding hunger, it was about healing wounds no one else could see. And somehow, I knew this was only the beginning of our story together. When they prepared to leave later that day, her mother stood at the door with tears in her eyes once again. She thanked me over and over, her words tumbling out, raw and emotional. "You don't know what this means to us," she said. I looked at her and replied gently, "You don't owe me thanks. Just take care of her. That's what matters." But the little girl tugged at my sleeve, her eyes pleading. "Can we come back?" she asked in a small, hopeful voice. My heart swelled, and without hesitation, I said, "Of course." As the door closed behind them, I stood in the quiet of my apartment, reflecting on everything that had happened. 3 days ago, I had fed a starving little girl outside a store. Tonight, she and her mother had found warmth under my roof. Life is unpredictable, messy, and sometimes harsh, but in those unexpected intersections, when we choose compassion, we create ripples that can change lives. I knew they would return, and when they did, my door would always be open, because sometimes, the smallest kindness isn't just a memento, it's the beginning of a family you never expected to find.